Part 1, Bloodlines of the Blade. They came after the silence. When Rome abandoned its distant province across the sea, it left behind no farewell gifts, only crumbling roads, cold stone walls, and frightened hearts. The Roman eagle no longer flew over Britannia. What remained was fog, forests, and fear. And into that vacuum came the boats, small, low-sitting vessels hugging the surf, packed with men, leather-bound, bearded. Not soldiers of empire, but wolves without a leash. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, tribes whose names once meant nothing, soon they would mean everything. They didn't arrive with the grandeur of Rome. There were no marble arches, no drums. Just the crack of axes on wooden shields and words no one here could understand. They weren't here to be part of a new world. They came to carve one, not in stone, but in flesh. The land didn't welcome them, not at first. But it didn't resist hard enough. The native Britons were weary, fractured, leaderless. They still sang songs of Arthur in the hills, but the swords in their hands were duller than the ghosts they worshipped. And so the Saxons came further inland. They didn't ask for titles. They took fields. They didn't negotiate treaties. They offered grain to the gods and took blood from men. But here's the cruel truth history teaches again and again. Sometimes it is not the builders who shape a nation. It is the destroyers. And in their fire, in their fury, in the language shouted across blood-soaked fields, a new world began. It had no name yet, but one day they would call it England. Part 2, Vortigrns deal with the wolves. History remembers him as a fool. Vortigern, a name carried by the wind in old Welsh songs, half king, half traitor, the ruler who opened the gate to the wolves. But history rarely shows the whole truth. In his eyes, he was not betraying his people. He was trying to save them. When the Romans left Britannia, they did not leave it empty. They left it exposed. Picts from the north poured down from the dark highlands, fierce and unafraid, their painted bodies moving like shadows at dawn. From across the Irish Sea came the Scotti, raiding western shores, burning churches, enslaving families, vanishing into the mist before any vengeance could follow. Britain was breaking. Its cities fell silent. Its villa lords retreated behind crumbling walls. Its peasants prayed to gods who no longer answered. And Vortigern, king in name more than reality, saw only one way to stem the bleeding. He sent for the Saxons. It was not the first time Rome had hired mercenaries from across the North Sea. For centuries, Saxon warriors had guarded Britain's coasts under Roman pay. But now there was no Rome to pay them. So Vortigern offered what he still controlled: land. Come, he told Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon brothers who led the first bands. Protect us from the Picts. Defend the eastern shores. In return, the grain will be yours. The earth will be yours. At first it worked. The Saxons fought like wolves unleashed. They built their timber forts along the east coast, raided the raiders, slaughtered the Picts in forests of ash and oak. For a moment, Britain breathed again. But wolves who taste blood do not sit idle for long. Hengist saw the weakness in Vortigern's court. He saw squabbling nobles, landowners with fat bellies and thin swords, priests clinging to vanished Roman glories. He saw a land rich, fertile, and undefended, and so he asked for more grain, more gold, more land. Vortigern, trapped between Saxons at his gates and rivals at his back, agreed. Some say he even married Hengist's daughter, Rowena, as part of the pact. A Saxon princess in a British court, a symbol of alliance or surrender. But no treaty can buy loyalty from hunger. When payment slowed, the Saxons took what they were promised by the sword. Villages burned, churches toppled. Fields turned red beneath the dawn. The mercenaries had become conquerors, and Vortigern, The songs say he wept in his tower, cursing the gods who had abandoned him, cursing the Romans who left him powerless, but perhaps most of all cursing himself for believing he could invite wolves to guard his sheep and not become their prey. In the chaos that followed, British resistance rose. Led by shadowy figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, warlords who rallied what remained of Rome's disciplined fighting men, they fought to hold the line. But they were not fighting a disciplined army. They were fighting hunger itself. The Saxons came not to occupy, they came to settle, to plow the land they claimed, to build wooden halls and raise families. Every village they conquered became a seed. Every seed became a tree. And soon an entire forest of Saxon settlements had spread across the east and south of Britain. The land was changing. The people were changing. And the language spoken over the ashes was no longer Latin. It was the rough, guttural tongue of the Germanic coast. The birth cry of English. Part 3, The Age of Migration, How Blood Became Identity. The Saxons were only the beginning. Soon came the Angles, their ships cutting across gray seas like shark fins. They landed further north, along the washed-out coasts of what is now East Anglia and Northumbria. With them came the Jutes, a smaller tribe but fierce, carving their settlements into Kent's river valleys. Each group carried its own chieftains, gods, and dialects, but to the Britons they were all the same, intruders. For generations they came in waves, entire families, farmers with oxen, blacksmiths with sons, hunters with dogs. They did not arrive as armies. They arrived as nations without land, dragging their worlds behind them in rough wooden carts. The age of migration was not a campaign. It was an exodus. Imagine the coasts, every sunrise bringing dark shapes on the horizon, sails catching misty winds, boats scraping onto sand and mud. Women stepping onto alien shores, clutching infants who would never see the forests of Saxony again. Men driving stakes into wet soil, raising halls from oak and pine felled inland. Within months, settlements rose where Roman villas once stood, smoke curling into skies that no longer smelled of incense and Latin hymns, but of burnt meat and salt. In these early days, there was no England. There was only survival. Villages clung to river bends and hilltops. Names shifted like water, Angleland, Englaland, eventually England. But no one spoke of kingdoms. Loyalty was to kin, to clan, to blood. To the Lord who shared their mead hall fire, not to any crown or cross. Here blood became identity. Who you were was written in your veins, Saxon, Angle, Jute, Briton. If you were Briton, you prayed to Christ and cursed the invaders in Welsh tongues. If you were Saxon, you sacrificed to Woden and Thunor, your gods of victory and thunder, and carved runes into your spear shafts before battle. This was not a multicultural merging. It was coexistence by conquest. The Saxons pushed west, pressing the Britons into the hills of Wales and Cornwall. The Angles spread north, creating new tribal territories, Bernicia, Dara, Lindsey. The Jutes held Kent, their smallest but fiercest realm. Each group built wooden churches beside their halls once missionaries arrived. Each minted coins with their king's name in crude Latin letters. Each began to believe that this land, so far from their ancestral forests, was now theirs by right. But beneath this growing sense of belonging lay the dark truth of its origin. It was paid for in blood. Villages razed. Monasteries looted. Ancient British churches abandoned, their stone crosses toppled and overgrown with moss. Thousands of Britons fled west or north, carrying only the songs of their ancestors, whispering of Arthur, the once and future king, who would return to drive out the invaders. But Arthur did not come. Instead, the Saxons came and stayed. They planted wheat and barley in Roman fields now unworked. They raised cattle where Roman garrisons once trained. They forged new societies from the bones of the old. And though each kingdom began small, by the 7th century, something strange was happening. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes began to see themselves not just as tribes, but as rulers of a new world. A world with no emperors. No legions, no Rome, only them. The Anglo-Saxons, Part 4, Kings without CROWNS, the rise of heptarchy. They did not call themselves kings at first. In their own tongue, they were syningas, leaders by blood and blade, not by divine ordination. No golden thrones awaited them, no marble halls carved with imperial triumphs. Instead, their seats were wooden, their halls smoky, their crowns mere bands of hammered iron or bronze. But power is not measured by polish. It is measured by obedience, and as the generations passed, obedience grew. By the dawn of the 7th century, the patchwork of Anglo-Saxon settlements had become something new. Kingdoms, not one kingdom, 7. The heptarchy historians would later call it the 7 crowns of early England. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, each with its own king, its own laws, its own gods or saints, its own dreams of dominance. In the north, Northumbria rose first, forged from 2 smaller realms, Bernicia and Dara. From their coastal fortresses and inland halls, kings like Edwin and Oswald ruled lands that once sang in Celtic tongues, now echoing with Saxon chants. They built wooden churches overlooking cliff-bound monasteries, where monks copied Latin gospels by candlelight, while their brothers swung swords against Welsh raiders in the mist. To the south, Mercia was rising too, the kingdom of the Midlands, the heartland of old Roman roads and new Saxon ambition. Its kings were warriors and schemers both, forging alliances by marriage, breaking them by bloodshed. Mercia's forest hid outlaw bands, pagan shrines, and silent watchers waiting for kings to fall. Further east lay East Anglia, land of fen and salt marsh, where reeds whispered over shallow waters and Saxon kings claimed descent from Woden himself. Their royal burials were among the most lavish, ships dragged inland and filled with treasure, swords, helmets, and drinking horns to carry kings into the next world as rulers still. The southeast fractured into smaller realms. Kent, settled by Jutes, was among the first to convert to Christianity, its Queen Bertha a Frankish princess who carried her faith across the Channel. Essex, Sussex, kingdoms of the East Saxons and South Saxons, held to pagan gods longer, their temples hidden among oak groves where offerings of milk and blood still stain the roots. And finally Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, land of chalk hills and Iron Age forts reborn as Saxon strongholds. In time, Wessex would rise higher than any, but in these early days it was merely one among many, a realm of warrior kings whose reach did not yet touch the future they would one day command. These were kings without crowns of gold. Their power was not proclaimed by empire, but by their hall warriors' loyalty, their ability to give gifts, to keep oaths, to crush rivals. A king who could not reward his men with rings of silver, arm rings, land grants, and fame was no king at all. In the Anglo-Saxon mind, a throne was not a seat. It was a circle of men, standing with swords drawn, swearing fealty. But though their kingdoms were divided, they shared something deeper than language, a sense that they were no longer merely tribes from across the sea. They were now lords of this land, rulers of fields sown with British bones and Saxon wheat alike. And slowly a vision began to form in the minds of poets and priests, that perhaps one day these lands could be united, that beneath the bloodshed there could be an England. But that dream was far away. For now there were 7 kings, 7 realms, and an uncounted number of blades waiting in the dark. Part 5, The Coming of Christ, Faith and the Forging of Identity. They came with steel and blood, but what they left behind was something softer, yet sharper than any sword: faith. For decades after their arrival, the Anglo-Saxons clung to the gods of their ancestors. Woden, god of war and wisdom; Thunor, god of thunder; Tiu, god of battle. Their shrines were simple: a carved pole in a clearing, a circle of stones by a river, an oak tree hung with offerings of cloth, milk, and sometimes blood. Their prayers were whispers to the wind and vows before battle. But across the sea, a different storm was rising. Christianity had never fully vanished from Britain. The Roman Church left behind broken churches and scattered priests, hiding among the Britons in the western hills. But for the Anglo-Saxons, these were alien gods of a conquered people. It was only when missionaries came anew from Rome, from Ireland, from Iona and Lindisfarne, that faith began to sink roots in Saxon soil. In 597 AD, a Roman monk named Augustine landed in Kent. Sent by Pope Gregory the Great, he carried no armies, no threats, only words. Words about a God who died nailed to wood, not wielding an axe. A God who blessed the poor rather than rewarding the strong. To warrior kings raised on conquest, it was an alien creed. But kings are pragmatic creatures. King Ethelbert of Kent saw in Christianity more than salvation. He saw an alliance with Rome, with Frankish power, with trade and legitimacy. So he converted, and with him his court, and with them his people. Baptisms spread like wildfire through the heptarchy, not all at once. Some resisted for generations, but over time the wooden idols fell. Churches rose in their place, at first simple timber halls with reed thatch, then stone minsters with carved crosses and bells ringing out across fields once soaked in pagan sacrifice. But Christianity did not merely replace old gods. It changed identity itself. For the first time, the scattered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms saw themselves as part of something larger, a Christendom, stretching across seas to Rome, beyond Rome to Jerusalem itself. The monks who wrote down their laws, copied their genealogies, and recorded their poems did so in Latin letters. Their heroes were still Saxon warriors, but their wisdom came from the Gospels. In monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow, monks labored over illuminated manuscripts, gold leaf, bright inks, runes of their old tongue slowly merging with Latin script. Here, faith and culture braided into a single cord, binding Saxon pride to Christian humility. But not all conversions were peaceful. In Northumbria, King Edwin converted after a lifetime in exile and war, convinced not by fear but by a missionary's simple logic. Your life is like a sparrow flying through a hall on a winter night. It enters from the darkness, briefly finds warmth and light, then flies out into the dark again. If this new faith tells us what lies beyond, it is worth knowing. So Edwin was baptized, and his realm followed. Yet beneath these holy waters, blood still flowed. Christian kings waged wars just as pagan kings had. Crosses were carried into battle beside wolf-totem banners. Conversions were sometimes enforced by sword. Faith softened their souls but hardened their purpose. Now conquest had divine justification. Victory was not only for their people but for their God. By the end of the 7th century, England was no longer merely Anglo-Saxon. It was Christian. The priests taught them to see themselves as one people under one God. The kings saw themselves as shepherds of not just land, but souls. And the poets sang new songs of Christ the warrior, of saints who battled demons, of martyrdom as the noblest death. Here, among smoke-darkened churches and rough timber halls, A new identity was being forged. English. Not yet united, not yet whole, but something deeper than blood or soil. A belief that they were a chosen people, guardians of a land blessed by Christ, protected by saints, destined for something more than mere survival. But destiny demands a price, and as the 8th century dawned, that price would come due. Part 6, Vikings, fire upon their new kingdom. They had built a world from ruin. From the ashes of Rome, the Anglo-Saxons raised timber halls and stone churches. They carved laws into oak staffs, sang poems of heroes and saints, tilled fields that once fed Roman legions. They thought the worst was behind them, that the gods, old or new, had given them peace. But in the year 793, peace died screaming. It came with the smell of salt and blood. Black-sailed ships cutting across cold northern seas, their dragon-proud hulls gliding silently at dawn. Men poured onto the beaches, taller, broader, armored in iron and furs, wielding axes that split shields and skulls alike. The Vikings had arrived. The first blow fell on Lindisfarne. Monks woke to the smell of burning thatch. The screams of brothers dragged from their prayers. Holy books torn apart, gold chalices wrenched from altars, stone crosses toppled into the sea. Some were slaughtered in their robes. Others were chained, marched to the ships, sold as slaves in markets from Dublin to Hedeby. England shuddered. For the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings were a terror beyond comprehension. Not just pagans, demons in human skin, untouched by mercy, unmoved by oaths, laughing as they burned Christ's houses to the ground. But the Vikings were not mere raiders. They were something the Saxons knew well, migrants with blades. They came first for gold and slaves. Then they came for land. By the mid-9th century, entire Viking armies were crossing the North Sea, the Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles named them. They landed in East Anglia, marched north to Northumbria, west to Mercia. They broke kingdoms that had stood for centuries. They beheaded kings, burned capitals, shattered alliances. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Mercia fell. Only Wessex remained. Here in the halls of Wessex, a young king rose to face them, Alfred. He was not born to be great. As a child, he was sickly, overshadowed by his warrior brothers. But when they died in battle, the crown came to him. And with it, the burden of saving a world already half in Viking hands. Alfred fought with desperation and cunning. He built fortresses, burhs, small walled towns to slow Viking advance. He created a navy of longships to challenge theirs at sea. He reformed laws, gathered scholars, translated Latin books into Anglo-Saxon so his people would know not just how to fight, but why. He taught them that they were more than scattered tribes, that they were English. In 878 at Edington, Alfred won his greatest victory. Surrounded, outnumbered, he led his Fiad, the citizen army of farmers and smiths, against Guthrum's Viking horde. Against all odds, they broke the shield wall, drove the invaders back, forced Guthrum to convert to Christianity as part of the peace. It did not end the Viking threat, but it ended the dream of total conquest. Alfred became more than king. He became father of England. His vision was simple but revolutionary, that the people of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria could be one people. That under God, with law and learning, they could stand unbroken. But even as Alfred's sons and grandsons expanded his legacy, driving Vikings north and east, integrating them into new laws, Danelaw, they called it, the blood price was enormous. Towns burned, villages depopulated, monasteries abandoned, thousands taken as slaves, an entire generation scarred by axe and flame, yet from this crucible the forging continued. The language became richer, laced with Norse words, sky, egg, knife, window. The laws became stricter, blending Saxon and Dane. The faith grew harder, sharpened by suffering. And the idea of England, no longer just a land of many tribes, began to take its final shape. A kingdom born from conquest and compromise, from soil watered by blood, from gods slain and reborn, from law and sword together. Here ended the age of migration. Here began the age of kingdoms. And though the Anglo-Saxons would one day fall to other conquerors, Normans with their castles and crossbows, what they built remained: the language, the laws, the sense of a people forged not by empire but by survival. Part 7, Legacy: How the Anglo-Saxons created modern England. They came as exiles, they ruled as conquerors, they died as kings. But their greatest legacy was not their thrones or their battles. It was something far quieter yet unbreakable: the idea of England itself. When the Anglo-Saxons first set foot on British shores, there was no single land to conquer. Only scattered tribes, Roman ruins, ghost roads winding through misty hills, and a people too fractured to stand together. Their arrival was bloody, their settlements brutal. Their rise to power was marked by betrayal, burning, and bone-deep sorrow. But from the chaos, they built order. They gave names to hills and rivers in a tongue that became English. They marked borders that would one day define counties. They built churches on pagan sites, forging spiritual continuity through conquest. They wrote laws that balanced tribal justice with Christian mercy, creating a framework where loyalty, oaths, and property had meaning beyond mere force. They forged England in three great fires: the fire of migration, when entire peoples crossed the sea in search of survival, unknowingly laying the foundation for a nation; the fire of faith, when Christianity reshaped their gods, laws, and hearts, binding them to something larger than tribe or clan; the fire of invasion, when Viking steel tempered their society into a harder, more unified realm, forced to become one or perish divided. By the time the Normans arrived in 1066, England was no longer a patchwork of warring tribes. It was a kingdom with kingship enshrined in ceremony and law, a church integrated with royal power, a language rich with Saxon earthiness and Norse sharpness. The Normans built castles on Anglo-Saxon foundations. They imposed new lords, but the peasants still sowed fields using words the Saxons brought. The laws they codified were extensions of Alfred's reforms. Even their scribes wrote in Latin upon a land whose place names remained stubbornly English: York, Sussex, Essex, Lincoln. Yet the Anglo-Saxon legacy is not just historical. It lives every time someone speaks English, a language born from Germanic roots, enriched by Norse raiders, French conquerors, and global journeys, but anchored in the simple, harsh, beautiful words of the Anglo-Saxon farmers and poets. It lives in the concept of common law, justice shaped by precedent and community rather than imperial decree. It lives in the stubborn individualism, the fierce defense of land and kin, the suspicion of distant authority, traits woven into the English cultural DNA from those days of wooden halls and oath-bound warriors. But perhaps their truest legacy is something deeper still: that nations are not born cleanly. They are forged in suffering, molded by greed and generosity, by prayer and violence, by exile and return. The Anglo-Saxons came with axes, but they stayed with plows. They sang of war, but also of home, of hearth fire, of the simple peace found in toil and faith. And it was this duality, war and work, conquest and cultivation, that built England. Not an empire imposed from above, but a kingdom grown from the soil, fertilized by blood, watered with tears and warmed by the fragile, stubborn hope of people who wanted nothing more than to live, to belong, and to shape the land that shaped them. Conclusion, the blood and the soil. They forged a kingdom without ever intending to. They gave birth to England without ever knowing the name. They came as strangers with foreign gods, but they became the ancestors of a people who would one day shape the world. And though their own age ended beneath Norman banners, the echo of their song still carries in every English word spoken today. Because in the end, kingdoms rise and fall, but language endures, memory endures. And the blood and the soil that gave birth to England still remember the footsteps of the Anglo-Saxons, the people who carved a homeland from fog and forest, with nothing but steel in their hands and hope in their hearts.